immigration in the United States. Your task is to maximize short-term profit and market share, period. If you don't do that, you're out and somebody else is in. In fact, in Anglo-American law, it's a legal requirement. But quite apart from that, you just have to do it or you're just not in that position anymore. It's a crime of the position, not of the individual. That means you've got to ignore externalities. In this case, the externality is the fate of the species. It means you have to try to convince people, you have to run big propaganda campaigns to convince people that global warming is a liberal hoax and so on, which is exactly what's being done. It's quite effective. I don't know what it is here, but in the United States, maybe about a third of the population thinks it's a serious problem at this point. And you take a look at the new Republican Congress, just about everyone who came in as a climate denier, it's all a liberal hoax, we don't want to do anything. They're already cutting down funding, not only for U.S. programs, but even for the International Scientists Organization, been defunded. They don't want to do anything about it because the fate of the species is an externality. And if you're working in a market system, you don't pay attention to it. Well, in this case, there's no taxpayer to bail you out. Once you destroy the possibilities of decent human survival, kiss each other goodbye. And that's where we are right now. This is not an abstract consideration. It's happening right before our eyes, right before our eyes. Now, those are serious problems, and it doesn't make sense to ask, is that person good or bad? There's an institutional structure which is lethal, harmful in the case of, say, financial institutions, but not lethal. Lethal in this case, and that's not the only one.
Can there be a society without organized violence? For instance, wars, civil war, dictatorship. What do you think the ideal world would look like?
Well, that was actually a question raised by two great 20th century figures, Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein. They came out in 1955 with a memorandum, kind of a statement to the people of the world, a declaration to the people of the world. It was about nuclear war. That's another case like global warming. It could be and probably will be the destruction of the species. Their declaration I forget the exact words, but it was exactly this. They said to the people of the world, you're facing a choice that is stark and unavoidable. Either mankind will abandon war or the species is finished. That's their conclusion, and I think it's plausible. There just can't be any more major wars. I mean, look, take, say, Europe. Europe for centuries was the most savage, brutal place in the world. The Europeans spent most of their time in creative energy and activity and figuring out ways to slaughter each other. That went on for centuries. Europe, in fact, created a technology and a culture of savagery and barbarism which is so extreme that they could conquer the rest of the world. I mean, if you look at the conflicts between Europe and India, Mexico, and so on, Europe always conquered the enemy, but by savagery. In fact, you read military historians, what they say is that for most of the world, war was a kind of a sport. For Europe, it was a science, and it won. So small groups of Europeans could massacre huge numbers of what they called barbarians, people who didn't think that war was a science. Well, that's the core part of European history up to 1945. Not since. Did genes change? No change in the genes. What happened is that Europeans finally realized that the next time they play their favorite game of slaughtering each other, it's all going to be over. You can't do it anymore. The level of savagery and violence has reached a point where you just can't make use of it. So something has to be done to cut it back. So yeah, that's an answer. It's not necessary in human nature. I mean, unless these forces are constrained, they'll blow up. But they can be constrained. So the chances of a major war inside Europe are very slight, which is a huge change from centuries of history.
Mr. Chomsky says that we should address the right audience, but he also says that people in power try to make dissidents be ignored in the least. In the light of this, what would be the most practical or efficient way to go about addressing the audience and trying to be heard by them?
That depends where you are. If you were, say, in El Salvador, there wasn't really an answer to that, because you're going to get your brains blown out, which is what happened. If you're in, say, Turkey, which is a moderately repressive society, pretty free, but not entirely, probably what they're doing is the best way. A constant protest, civil disobedience, and so on. I mean, I've been in Turkey a number of times over the past 10 years and have actually participated in some of these civil disobedience actions. I was there a couple months ago, and there was a major conference on freedom of speech, and the participants, mostly Turkish, were journalists, artists, academics, and others, describing the activities that they're involved in, which are very courageous. A lot of them are working on Armenian rights and trying to bring about the recognition of the Armenian genocide and the repression of Armenian sins. And most of them are working on Kurdish rights. That's the big issue. And it was extremely brutal in the 1990s. It's been improving some since, but still going on. Well, that's the best method for them, facing real problems. The best method for people like us is much easier. We have very limited constraints. I mean, enough freedom has been won in societies like ours, so that it's not perfect, and you're not going to get lauded, but there's a wide range of opportunity to do all kinds of things without suffering the kinds of severe penalties that only saints are willing to endure.
One final question. Okay. Is it possible to be well-intentioned while committing atrocities? If so, should these good intentions change our assessment of these atrocities?
I think it's not only possible to be well-intentioned, at least by self-perception, while committing atrocities, but it's almost universal. You just take a look at the record of major criminals. I'm talking about people like Hitler and Stalin and the rest of them. Not just sort of garden variety atrocities, but world-shaking ones. You take a look at the record, it's being done with the utmost nobility. Hitler invaded Poland to protect Germany from what he called the wild terror of the Poles. The Germans had no choice. The Poles were terrorizing them. They had to defend themselves. Slaughtering the Jews was saving the purity of civilization. Hitler didn't talk about it much, but people like Martin Heidegger did. I remember, I was kind of surprised when, in recent years, there was kind of discussion of the discovery that Heidegger had been a Nazi. I started reading him in the 1950s. Take a look at Introduction to Metaphysics. You get in 20 pages. He's talking about how it's the task of Germany to save civilization, which comes from the Greeks to the Teutons. The Germans are the inheritors, and they have to protect it from the barbarians of the East and West. And corrupt elements have to be eliminated, and so on. So what can be more noble than preserving the civilization handed to us, to the Greeks? Okay, that's the Nazis. You read the a lot of Russian archives have come out in the in the last, since 1990. And they're pretty interesting reading. I mean, you take a look at the internal discussions. You know, Gromyko talking to Molotov and all this business, talking to each other, not trying to impress anyone. Now, they're talking about the need to defend democracy, people's democracies, from Western fascists. That's why you had to control, prevent anything from happening in Eastern Europe. You know, again, perfectly noble. And in fact, it's very rare to find anyone who says, I'm carrying out terrible crimes because I want to. You know, maybe there are people like that, but I think almost always you find a way to justify it. And I suspect if you look at your own experiences, you'll find plenty of things like that. Like maybe when you were, 6 years old and your mother wasn't looking, you took a toy from your younger brother or something, and he went and ran and complained to your mother, and she came to see what's going on, and you said, I didn't do anything. He gave it to me. He didn't want it. It was mine anyway, and so on and so forth. You find a way to justify what you're doing, and you believe it. You really believe it. You convince yourself of it. And I think that's probably true quite generally. I think, not nice maybe, but I think it's probably true.
I'm going to commit a well-justified, abominable atrocity and conclude this discussion.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you, Noam Chomsky, for coming here, for giving your lecture, for telling us about your intellectual life, for giving us an example of how an academic, how an intellectual could act in this strange but nevertheless very beautiful society. Let me remind you of one fact before I close down, we go to coffee. The building we are in is an Armenian church, not an Armenian, but an Armenian church, which means it is the church for a branch of Dutch Reformed people who are tolerant in every way. And I think that's a very appropriate place to have you had your speech here. I wish you a very good stay here in Utrecht and hope to meet you soon.